What are the decrees of God? The decrees of God are His eternal purpose, according to the counsel of His will, whereby for His own glory He hath foreordained whatsoever comes to pass.
In question 7 of the Shorter Catechism, we return to another fundamental question. We've asked things like, what is our purpose in life? Where do we come from? Who is God? What is the standard for what we're to believe and do? Well, we come back to another such question. And the question is, who's in control? So the question that is addressed in this catechism question is, who is in control? And the answer is God. So when we speak about the sovereignty of God, that's what we're asking. Who is in control? And when we say in control, we mean in control of everything. I think, well, this seems rather abstract kind of question, but it's actually very practical. Because think with me for a second. When you're running late, so for parents, you're running late to an appointment, and there's someone driving very slowly in front of you, and you're tempted to become frustrated because you want to go faster. What's the problem? The problem is we're not in control. We're not getting to determine how fast we want to go. And for the Christian, ultimately, we have to say, even in those situations, no, God is in control, and God has set this person in front of me, and I need to submit. I need to come under His wise governance and providence rather than becoming frustrated. And there are a lot of other practical ways in which this confronts us on a day-to-day basis. But the point is that God has not only set a plan, He's established a plan, He's also the one who executes. He executes that perfect plan as well. He brings that plan to pass. He makes it happen. And so here we're talking about the decrees of God. And you'll notice, if you look carefully at the words, it speaks of decrees in the plural and of purpose in the singular. Sorry, decrees, whereas purpose. The decrees of God are His eternal purpose. God has one eternal purpose which is carried out in the execution of the appointment and execution of His decrees that He has laid out for us. So let's think for a second about the characteristics of these decrees. Well, the first thing that we see in our catechism is that they're eternal. So when you decide to make plans, children, you say, well, on my birthday I'm going to do such and such, or next week I'm planning to go somewhere. You're making plans, and you're making plans right now for next week or some other time. God's plan, God's decree is eternal. So it didn't have a beginning. It's not as if God's decrees came into existence at some point in time. They're before time. So before the world was created, before man fell from sin, before all of the other things that have transpired in history took place, before all of that, God had established His plan for history. He had established His plan. It's also unchangeable. His decrees can't be altered. It's not as if something can happen in history that will make God alter the decree that He's established. His plan is going to come to pass perfectly. So what we do, or what big nations do, or what powerful people do, doesn't affect God's plan. It's all being brought to pass according to His will. It's also, His decrees are over everything. They're all-encompassing. It's not as if God decrees to save a people for himself, but not the other stuff. Or that God decrees big things like the flood, but not the little details like, bed bugs getting, in your cabin while you're camping somewhere. No, God controls all of the details. It's also unconditioned. His decrees are unconditioned by what's happening outside of himself. So nothing outside of God, whether it's angels or planets blowing up or whatever else, nothing changes or determines God's decree outside of himself. And then it's perfectly powerful, we'll just say powerful, efficacious, powerful both in the means and ends. So God not only determined to destroy the whole world with the flood, he determined all of the means. Water would come from under the earth, water would come from above the earth. God determined exactly how he would bring it to pass. In 40 days, all of this water would encompass the whole world and so on. So he determines both the means he's going to use as well as the end that he is going to use. So these are characteristics of God's decrees. When we think more particularly about his redemption, we see some further details. So it speaks about the decrees of God are his eternal purpose, according to the counsel of his will, whereby for his own glory he hath foreordained whatsoever comes to pass. When it says foreordained, what does that mean? He foreordained. Well, the word ordained means that he appointed it, planned it, determined it. The word for means beforehand. So God determined everything that happens before it happens. All of the details. When God speaks about our redemption, it speaks about foreknowing us. Well, you know what this word means, knowing. But he knew us beforehand. Now there are people that think, okay, what this means is God looked down through the tunnel of history and he saw the people that would believe on him and he chose those people to be saved. But that's not what foreknow means. Foreknow could be translated, or at least should be interpreted, in terms of foreloved. God loved us beforehand. God placed his desire for good upon us before we were ever created, before anything else was done by us, in us, with us, or to us. So in Romans 9 he says, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. And he said that this was true before they were even born, that the purpose of his election might stand. Now there are people who get a little uneasy. Some people get even angry about this sort of thing because they say, well, that makes God the author of sin. If God's the one who has a plan that he has made before time and that plan comes to pass, then God's the author of sin. Well, the Bible makes clear that God is not the author of sin, that God is not the one who is the origin, if you will, of sin. People say, well, this means that man doesn't have any free will then. Well, we're going to come to a whole question on man's free will here in a little bit. One of the questions that's coming up in the near future, where we'll actually talk about what does it mean for man to have a free will, and in what ways does he have a free will, and in what ways does he not have a free will. People think in terms of, well, this will make people inactive or passive. They won't want to do anything because God's already determined it ahead of time. But the opposite happens when God works in the hearts of his people by the gospel. We know God has a plan that can't be unhinged, that can't be deterred, and therefore we're all the more energetic to do the things that He's called us to do by His grace and dependence upon Him, knowing that He'll bring to pass His good purposes. So when we think about the decrees of God, the origin of them, where are they to be found? Where did they begin? It's in God's mind. God is the one who has determined them. When we think in terms of the purpose, it's His own will. When we think of, so this is purpose, when we think of the end that He's aiming at, it is His own glory. So the reason that God does what He does is because what He does will maximize His own glory, will bring Him the greatest glory. So this means nothing is outside of God's control. Nothing. So when you're lying in your beds at night and you're thinking, sad thoughts, or you're maybe a little scared or worried in the dark, you need to remember God's decrees are eternal. They're unchangeable. Nothing can happen outside of God's control. God is the one who has a plan that He's going to bring to pass, and nothing can change that. We need to think about the Lord Himself. We need to have in our hearts and in our minds confidence that God determined when we would be born, how we would be born, when we would die, how we would die. And all of those things that we call accidents, where you bump your knee, you skin your knee on the ground, or you accidentally drop a cup at the table, or someone's in a car accident, these things weren't intended by us, so they're accidents in that sense. We didn't mean to do them. But God does stand behind all of that. God has a plan. God is in control. And so it's not an accident in the ultimate sense. And this should be a means of encouraging and strengthening us in our walk before Him. It should comfort us. God has a plan. He is in control, and what He is doing will maximize His own glory and praise. So it says, what are the decrees of God? The decrees of God are His eternal purpose, according to the counsel of His will, whereby for His own glory He hath foreordained whatsoever comes to pass.